Welcome to Let's Talk About the Deep Stuff. I'm your host, Sean Kneese. On this show, we have off the cuff and candid conversations about the big topics in the world. Today, I want to tackle something that's really been bugging me lately. That's echo chambers and whataboutism. These two things are like a plague in the US right now. People are shouting past each other, not bothering to see things from another perspective, and worst of all, they're not even willing to admit when their own side messes up. You see, this left-right divide is tearing us apart, man. We would rather cozy up to whoever agrees with us and bash anyone who dares to disagree. And sure, I know this isn't just an American thing. It's happening everywhere. But as an American, it's easier to speak on my direct environment. So let's talk about echo chambers first. It's like living in a bubble where you only hear what you want to hear, and anything else just gets filtered out. We're so stuck in our own little worlds that we forget there's a whole lot more out there. Now, whataboutism? That's another beast entirely. It's like the ultimate deflection move. Instead of addressing a valid point, you just throw back a what about to distract from the issue at hand. It's frustrating as hell and is killing any chance of a real dialogue. I've been blessed in life by developing close connections with people from all different backgrounds and walks of life. I've also developed friendships with people who think differently than me on various topics. What matters most to me is if their heart is in the right place and how they treat others on a day-to-day basis. There's a common meme today stating that we can disagree on food toppings, but not whatever controversial topic they're happen to be referring to when they use that meme. And it's been used in various contexts. I say that I disagree with that premise entirely. If we can't agree civilly on topics more important or controversial than food toppings, I'd say we're in trouble. And as Daryl Davis once said, who I know that my guest I'm going to introduce soon is a big fan of, as Daryl Davis once said, keep in mind, when two enemies are talking, they're not fighting. They're talking. They might be yelling and screaming, but at least they're talking. It's when the talking ceases that the ground becomes fertile for violence. So yeah, that's what's been on my mind lately. And in this discussion, I wanted to focus on how we move beyond whataboutism and echo chambers and find nuance amongst the noise. And getting to my guest who is joining me in this discussion, I have a YouTuber who goes by the name of Grappling Ignorance, and he's tackled controversial topics like this on his own YouTube channel. In the past, he's mentioned the importance of hearing out people with different views and engaging with them rather than staying in your own echo chamber. So first off, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
And maybe just talk about your own background and experience on the topic we're discussing today and give your thoughts.
Yeah, possibly ironically, I don't know that we're going to have a lot of disagreement on this topic. They are also two things, particularly the echo chamber issue is one that I think is plaguing us at the highest degree right now. I'm pretty sure everybody has experience with this. It's whether or not they are conscientious of it, which might be part of our solution, is moving towards at least being aware of a lot of these problems. You know, many of the fallacies that we fall into. I think step one is being aware that we're all vulnerable to them. So we unintentionally tend to put ourselves now into digital echo chambers, right? Where in whatever social media you use, you tend to surround yourself with the kinds of people that you like, and you tend to surround yourself with people who are going to agree and support you. And if you cultivate a group of followers or friends or whatever it is based on common relationships, then of course you're creating a form of echo chamber. Now, for me, the people that I consider friends have to be the kinds of people that I can have disagreements with, that because well, for one thing, you're not much of a friend to me if you're a yes man, if you're just nodding along or going along. People that I consider friends are people that can call me out or help me see the things that I can't see for myself. And it's also more interesting to have conversations with people where I have some areas of disagreement. So I think a lot of us talk about our experience with that, with echo chambers take place in the digital world, where even if, let's say, you have a coworker that follows you on social media that offers you some pushback, it's very easy to either you could outright block that person or say, oh, well, that person's out of the discussion. I'm not interested in that. I don't come to social media where I get most of my interaction. I don't come here for negative things, and being uncomfortable is a negative thing, even if we all know that discomfort is what leads to growth, right? You have to have discomfort
Yeah.
in order to have growth. Or there's a softer version of that where you don't outright block or ban somebody. You simply you still have the majority of people that are also seeing their comments or their feedback. They are going to be on your side or likely to be on your side, particularly if they don't know that other person. So it's a bit of a different ball of wax when you get into the bigger picture of social media, where I just talked about the kind of your personal thing where your personal friends are gathering together. When you get into social media accounts that are, tens of thousands of people, you are looking at a bunch of strangers that can choose to either let themselves in or out of a conversation based on what is comfortable to them or what they feel passionate about. And you have a different level of problem there when you have people interacting anonymously. And it can feel like you can feel the frustration of even just I'm so surrounded, I'm used to in my personal social media circle only seeing opinions that agree with me. Therefore, when I see this person who dares to push back, even if they do so in a way that's polite, it feels offensive. And a lot of times when we push back, we don't push back politely because we're encountering things that we are offended by people having this opposing position. So yeah, that's my experience with it. We can get into solutions whenever you want. But yeah, I think we all share that experience with at least that part of the topic, whether we mean to or not. And the partial starting point is at least being aware, like any fallacy, that we are vulnerable to it as well.
Yeah, and a lot of that is that more people now are getting their news digitally too, and in some ways, there's more information out there that way, but that also kind of created the echo chambers too. And then you'll see with the older generation, a lot of them are watching TV news, and like sometimes I'll talk to my parents, and I'm like, oh, they're getting a totally different story than what I'm getting because they're looking at the TV news. So it's like there's just that that's where a lot of that comes from too. So it's like it's a way to I guess it's because people they have their own biases and everything, and it's hard to just manage all the information that's out there. But I guess the way to break through that is to just talk, to have conversations with different people, or see that multiple things could be true at the same time. Maybe certain things from um, the other side of stuff could be true, while your side stuff from your side could be true too. But it's all part of like the bigger picture.
I think that's a huge part of having good faith rhetoric that you touched on in your introduction is largely missing. That it's you have to be intentional if you're going to have a good faith conversation with somebody that has a significant difference from you. And it's kind of elementary thinking. It's very instinctual thinking to give no ground in a conversation, and you people oftentimes feel like it's this counterintuitive nature that things that are actually really good for you or good for conversation or discourse are we have a perception that they would make us look weak or frail or whatever synonym you want to use for that, such as admitting that somebody that you're arguing with has a good point, or even admitting when you've made a mistake. Never in my life has anybody ever admitted, hey, I made a mistake on that, and then I'm going to take responsibility for that, and then I had less respect for that person. Pretty much always I have at least neutral, if not a lot more respect, because it's a hard thing to do. But I think more than it being a hard thing to do, people are reluctant to give up ground in an argument, admit that somebody made a good point, admit that you made a mistake. Goodness admit that you were wrong about something. But when you do those things, it bridges those gaps a lot. It really puts people's defenses down and lets you have a conversation. When you are willing to admit, hey, I didn't think about it that way, and I'm going to rethink that, or that's a pretty good point, or
Yeah.
I was mistaken there.
And that seems to be the tactic to kind of do the opposite, where you don't call out your side, or you won't. And I guess the left right paradigm. I guess you said that you used to, at least when I last talked to you, you said you were more on the left leaning side, but you were open to like criticizing your own side or hearing from the other side. I guess I'm more. I don't like to really put a label on myself, but I guess a lot of my values go more towards the left or liberal too. Would you say, like, what do you think of like this left right paradigm? Does it kind of just compartmentalize us too much, or?
Oh, of course. Yeah. And we're kind of most people, either, it's either they are firm, they feel comfortable planting their flag in this is where I am, this is how I want to identify politically, or they're very uncomfortable with that. And I think you and I share that as well. I will generally identify myself as left leaning on most issues just because that's the shorthand. But one of the complications is that that's such an incomplete picture of anybody, even somebody who firmly plants their flag on the right or the left. But as soon as we hear that, we get all these ideas in mind, right? Okay, what does that mean? This is where they stand on this issue. This is where they stand on this issue. This is where they stand on this. That's if we're being intellectual about it. We often, use that as a shorthand to make a bunch of assumptions. If we're more clumsy about it, we make assumptions that they are either good or bad people now, which is obviously not very nuanced. But a lot of people in America, in our current culture, if you identify as A or B, they are going to then in their minds go, oh, okay, good person, bad person. Oftentimes that is from, I think, a lack of good faith conversations, a lack of exposing yourself to people whose positions make you uncomfortable, and a willingness to enter conversations trying to learn about the other side, which you alluded to Daryl Davis earlier, who I will confirm, yes, I'm a big fan of Daryl Davis, both the blues musician and activist and the basketball player, two separate guys, but they're both great. Daryl Davis mentions a willingness to learn, and he started when he started interacting with a leader of the Ku Klux Klan, he was not there to argue with him. He was there to learn from him. And that curiosity is just so sorely missing. And if we allow ourselves to be curious, if we allow ourselves to try to learn from somebody, we have much more productive conversations, because you're never going to, if you and I'm sure we could find something where we strongly disagree, right? And if we were to try to hammer it out, we could sit here and go back and forth and try to convince each other for 2 hours, but we wouldn't learn or have nearly as interesting or productive of a conversation as if I were just trying to understand where you're coming from and you were to try to understand where I'm coming from, because we could both do that better very easily in a quarter of the time. You could see what I mean if that's what you were trying to do, and I could understand what you mean if that's what you were if that's what I was trying to do. But it's almost impossible for one of us to convince the other one to come to our side.
Yeah, and Daryl Davis is like kind of an extreme of that, because like most people you meet won't be KKK, but like
Right.
most people can't talk to just like regular people on a regular basis they meet, and he talked to people that hated him as soon as they met him because he was African American, but he got them to, like, by listening to them, they kind of then empathize with him more, and they're like, wait, these views I have are kind of stupid. So
yeah, well, it speaks to the power of that. It speaks to the power of, hey, and you can see very easily, particularly in an extreme situation like that, where I'm sure that KKK members, when they do have a conversation, if they're outed or if they are in public in KKK regalia and a typical Black American is going to have a conversation with them, it's very easy for that person to get hostile, to get to go on offense. And I'm sure that those are very unproductive conversations and interactions. It speaks to the power of people who have obviously you're down a pretty committed path of a certain direction if you're putting on a KKK robe. But the ability for anybody, let alone a Black American man, to get you to the table and get you having a back and forth, it speaks to the true power of just listening, like just try to understand where somebody's coming from. And the follow up to that becomes you can stop straw manning your opponent when you do that. Okay. And if we could all just ask some more questions, like genuine questions in our conversations, and think of good questions for each other, it'll make our conversations much more productive, including if you want to, if you're trying to change people's minds, the best target for that, of course, is like fence sitters who are listening. If you're really trying to change one person's mind, be it like a social media conversation or whatever it is, very unlikely to happen, but you can change fence sitters' minds. And if you want to do that effectively, you need to have a firm and thorough understanding of your opposition. And you can't do that if you're pro-choice and you assume that your opposition just hates women. Okay. And you write them off as you want to control women's bodies and you don't want them to have choices. And if you're pro-life and you assume that your opposition just hates babies and wants to murder fetuses, you're going nowhere. All right. You're spinning your wheels. You might get excitement out of the people who already agree with you and are equally uninformed or ill-informed or unexposed to the opposition. You might get people who already agree with you to go rah rah, but you're not going to effectively convince fence sitters, let alone people who take the opposition.
Yeah, and that got me to think of a specific example I want to mention, which was 2020, the George Floyd protest when there was the COVID lockdown after George Floyd was killed by the officer Derek Chauvin, and there was the Black Lives Matter protest, and it was during the COVID lockdowns. So a lot of people on the right I talked to, like I'm not a fan of Trump, but I'm generous enough to say that like not all Trump supporters are like Richard Spencer or were like outright racist. Like, and I know there were some liberal media outlets that tried to show it that way. And I remember there was one that was a Latino Trump supporter, and they actually like they tried to ask her like, oh, why are you supporting Trump? Are you pro self-hate? Instead of like actually trying to figure out why she supported Trump. But some of these people on the right, like I tried to say, like, well, not everybody, because they would point out, like the people that were using it as an excuse to riot or like steal from stores or whatever. And I was saying, but there's all these other places where the protests are peaceful, and they're making this point about police brutality and racial profiling. And I've had some friends who are people of color that they have more run-ins with the police than I do, or they've had more negative experiences with the police than I have. I used to have more negative experiences, like when I had long hair and stuff, and like wore the metal shirts that. But then, like so I was trying to show, like, and there was even a video where some of the Black Lives Matter protesters, like, there was this one like white anarchist girl, and she was painting on the building, and then they were like, hey, don't do that. And then like and they said in the video like, hey, this isn't us. And another video where they were trashing businesses, and somebody who supported the protest was like, hey, don't break down our community, because like like these businesses weren't like the system or anything. These were small businesses, and a lot of them were minority owned businesses. So like that was just opportunists taking advantage of the situation. But like I felt like with people on the right, like no matter how much I would say like, oh, that's not the whole protest, they just wanted to push their narrative. Like, no, they're all just rioting, they're all just going crazy, they're all just doing this. And then on the other side, like people on the left wouldn't call out their side and be like, hey, these people aren't really helping the movement. They would say, oh, this is just the reaction to oppression, when a lot of that wasn't. First of all, I think that's kind of racist, because you're acting like all African Americans are a monolith and they're all agreeing with the tearing up businesses, when a lot of them weren't. Like it was a mix of people. Like some of it was white people like doing that too. Like it was just people who took they saw a situation and they they took advantage of the situation. And then there was also this thing that like somehow you couldn't have issues with the lockdown and support Black Lives Matter. Like somehow those are two contradictory things. Like those are two different issues that have nothing to do with each other. So like I don't see why you couldn't like, hey, I don't like police brutality, but I also have some issues with the lockdowns. And there was just all this like people not listening to each other, and this like you can't hold these two positions at the same time. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that specific example.
Uh, yeah. So you touched on something there, which is pretty important, and that is, and you mentioned it earlier too. Two people can be right at the same time. Usually, and what a lot of the heart of this, including whether you're bringing up whataboutism in the course of your rhetoric or you're dealing with the confusion that happens in echo chambers, is nuance, right? And this is for, gosh, the last 10, 15 years. I think a lot of people who are thinking about rhetoric have just seen nuance slip away. And it's not just in our debates and arguments and conversations. It's in our media and film. It gets harder and harder to see subtlety and nuance, and anything that's meant to appeal to mass audiences. You could say that it's dumbing down these properties. So the way that we think about the world becomes less nuanced, and that hurts all of these things. That hurts all these conversations. So yes, two people can be right at the same time. You know, you can be right to say, man, an abortion is an unfortunate thing that somebody would feel that they need to go through that process. And yeah, that is an unfortunate thing. And yeah, maybe the takeaway from that is that we find ways to prevent those from happening if they aren't necessary. But yeah, you're right. That is an unfortunate thing. You can also be right to say that a woman should have a right to choose, and it's between her and her doctor whether or not she receives that procedure. You're right about that as well. Two people can also be wrong. You know, in that example again, or you know, you asked specifically about the George Floyd race riots, or the follow-ups that came through that. Yeah, two people can be right and two people can be wrong. It's usually a combination of them, right? Or you're right about this, but you're wrong about this thing. You're right about your position, but you're wrong about what I think about my position just because I disagree with you. We jump to conclusions such as, I think it's very important what you mentioned earlier about being willing to criticize your own quote unquote side of a debate. We do get lumped to the groups of left and right, particularly in modern United States political conversations. I tend to be more openly critical of my own side of most issues. That is because I care when the side that I am advocating for is messing up. I care when they are poorly representing my position. I care if I vote for a politician and he or she does or says things with which I strongly disagree. I care about that way more than the person that I already generally disagree with. If they want to, like, I expect that of them. So, but you find that when you are critical of one side, the understandable but inaccurate assumption is that you are pro the other side. So when I criticize the actions of the Biden administration, I am then lumped in as a Trump supporter. And, you know, the opposite happens as well, which is, in my case, also untrue. If I am critical publicly of Donald Trump, I am now like, people's response will often be, and we're getting into some of the nuance of rhetoric here. So let's say I offer a pushback against Donald Trump. Hey, I'm going to criticize the fact that Donald Trump ran on essentially a single issue for most of his 2016 campaign, which was he was going to build a wall at the southern border to stop immigration, and he was going to make Mexico pay for it. Okay, I'm going to criticize that. And the response that I get from that is, you can't possibly be satisfied with what the Biden administration is doing. Like, whoa, whoa, we went into a totally different direction here. You made an assumption, and then to the point again, I guess we're getting into the whataboutism here. You're now talking about something else, and with whataboutism, the good faith interpretation is somebody who's doing that is trying to call out hypocrisy. The good faith interpretation is, oh, you went there because hypocrisy is bad, and you want to call out hypocrisy. So my solution when I encounter that whataboutism on any given topics, and forgive me for jumping around with different examples when you asked about a very specific one, but my counter to that is to try to gently table that and get back to the topic at hand. And particularly with that technique of, hey, I'm trying to understand this position more. And sometimes there's a lot of work just in getting people to agree on the facts now that didn't used to be as big of a problem.
Yeah.
We would come together, we would understand, we'd recognize the facts, okay? But now, and we're going to argue about the conclusions that we draw from the facts. But now it seems like we have trouble getting past that first part. we're debating
it's not just
facts.
your own opinions, it's your own facts. That's another thing too, because not getting the same, like, people won't even admit. I've been noticing that a lot, especially with the big thing that's going on now with Israel and Palestine. Like, to me, it's like the two things could be true. Like, for me, I'm Jewish. I don't identify with Israel, like, Jewish by heritage, not religion, but like I empathize with the plight of the Palestinians. I don't like how they've been treated over the years, and I don't like the right wing government of Israel, and I don't like what they're doing in Gaza now as like the collective punishment. But I also don't think the civilians being killed on October 7th was good either, and I don't think the hostages that were taken on those days, like, I think those are innocent people too. And I also understand that, like, there were also Jews that from Middle Eastern countries that had nowhere else to go when Israel was formed too, and also, like, Europe didn't want Jews, and then unfortunately also the Palestinians were forced out of their homes. So I think I could kind of recognize I recognize both of those things at the same time. But there's like a big whataboutism. Is like, oh, you're sad that a Palestinian child died. Well, but what about the Israeli kid that got killed? It's like, well,
yeah,
they're both human beings getting killed. Why can't you just be upset for both? Like,
yeah, it's another great example of both sides being wrong. And again, or with these issues in particular, I'm very cautious about getting into or taking strong positions on matters where I'm so distant from them. To like be properly educated and thoroughly understand an issue like that is, I think, important if you're going to make any kind of bold statements. But I don't think it's a bold statement to recognize, in my ignorant layperson American, I've never set foot in the Middle East position. I don't think it's a controversial thing to recognize that, like, hey, this thing's bad and this thing's bad. But people don't want that nuance. They want a boogeyman. They want a silver bullet to shoot at the boogeyman. They want a clear, easy enemy because that's what's easiest in our brain. We want to identify a threat. We want to take out the threat. We want to know who our allies are and side with those allies. So the nuance gets a little lost, and people want to break out their calculators, and figure out, well, which one's worse. And this is also what we in America do every 4 years. We break out our calculators and say, okay, well, who's the least worst of these two people? Because we have to.
And if you try to vote for like a third party, or you say, no, well, why don't we find something better? They're like, oh, well, you just want Trump to win. But before it was Trump, it was Romney. Or before, it's like, there's every election is always like, oh, you can't vote for a third party or like something new because, this one is the one that decides everything. They always use that fear of like, well, the lesser of two evils, it's.
Could I speak to that, though it's off topic?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the concept of a third party, I think, is one of, if we're ever going to see significant political change or challenge to the duopoly, I think you have to activate non-active voters would be the first thing, because you have like close to 50% of our country, even in like the federal elections where people are the most apt to participate, you still have about half of us that don't. Okay. So if you could just get non-voters to vote third party, doesn't matter what party it is, in one election cycle, you get half of them.
Yeah.
Get a third of the people who right now are just disenfranchised with the system. You don't have to get them all to get on the same side and believe in a cause and vote for an establishment candidate. In fact, I think in some ways that could be pretty damaging. But if you get them to vote for third, it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be the same third party candidate. Get a good chunk of people who currently do not vote to vote third party, and you instantly change the game. I don't care what they say. Both parties prefer lower turnout rates, because the lower the voter turnout, the fewer people they have to appeal to. Based on the system currently, they already only have to appeal to a tiny sliver of swing voters in a tiny sliver of swing states. But a robust third-party presence or multiple third-party presence is not likely, probably in our lifetime, to win an election, but it will absolutely show those candidates that they are not entitled to just have these things automatically. It will show them that they have to look at where the Overton window is moving, and they have to address those other people. So one of the best things that I think you can do if you're frustrated with the system, if you're frustrated with the duopoly that we have, if you're annoyed that we consistently find two of the most heinous people to represent and choose from when we should be picking from two of our best, is if you weren't going to vote anyway, go vote for a third party candidate. Preferably, do some research on who actually reflects your values. Likely you can find one that is not in the duopoly, who is whether you're more libertarian or you're more like progressive, there's likely a third party candidate that reflects your values more. And rather than sitting it out, voting for one of them, that is political activism that's very easy to do, but has high potential for actually affecting change.
Yeah, but what you were saying just now actually made me think of like when I first got aware of this whole like during the Obama years, like in 2008, I remember like I voted. That was like the first time I voted. I voted for Obama because I thought he was going to be a change from Bush, with like the Iraq War and the Patriot Act and everything. And then when Obama became president, he actually ended up starting to continue. He ended up continuing a lot of Bush's policies, like he expanded the Patriot Act. There was also the National Defense Authorization Act, which I know was allowed to like detain Americans without trial. He also continued a lot of the intervention in the Middle East, but then people kind of painted it in a liberal way that like because like which like that we're helping these people, we're like, but that was pretty much what the neocons were saying about Iraq too. But then it's because Obama was doing it, it's a more of a liberal thing, and then it's like then the consistency started being lost there, because like then like he was doing a lot of the same stuff Bush was doing, but like because he was a liberal and he was their guy, like there wasn't the same consistency.
Yeah. You're getting into part of a very human problem of, and we've seen a more extreme version of that now, and that is like our capacity for personality and emotion, which exists for a good reason, right? Like, I don't mean to, and we often can get into this attitude that like emotion or thinking or feeling things is a negative thing, or using our emotional intelligence is a negative thing. It's not. I mean, it's the sort of thing that it exists in us for a reason. It's been part of our evolutionary success, that for, in some cases, emotion to take over logic. But that has also made us susceptible to bad decisions. And it's very human, when George Bush was running, this
Yeah.
notion that, we're gonna, I want to vote for a candidate that I would drink a beer with. The hell's wrong with you? Why? Why does that matter to you? Well, it matters because we're humans, and
Yeah.
when we want to pick someone who connects with us on a human level. So that is one of the errors that we have, and that is combined with the human tendency to not want to be wrong, which leads for people to double down on decisions that they make by mistake, such as voting for a certain political candidate and then not being able to hold that candidate accountable, because that would mean I'm implicitly admitting that I was wrong. I also 2008 was my first election that I was eligible to participate in. I also voted for Obama, and it hurts to recognize that I also bought a lot of his campaign promises. I believed in that.
Yeah.
It makes me forgiving of people who fall victim to candidates now who make promises that appeal to them, that resonate with them for whatever reason. So because we are humans, it's very easy for us to buy into a personality versus logically examining the decisions that people make, the policies that inform them. If you were to ask the average Trump supporter, just the average Trump supporter in America, hey, what are 3 of Trump's policies that you like that he's running on right now for the 2024 election? Most of them could not outline actual policies. If you were to ask people that are stands for Biden or who plan to vote for Biden, if you were to ask them, hey, what are 3 of the policies the Biden administration has done over the last 4 years that you think are positive and that we should keep going moving forward? Most of them could not do that. They have bought into this character, this person, and they don't want to hold themselves or that person accountable, and they haven't dug into policy. Policy is much harder. It's more boring. Who wants to sit there and read or actually hear out what someone's plan is? It takes a lot more intellectual heavy lifting than it does to say, oh, he said the thing that made me happy, or he is the opposition to the thing that the person saying the things that make me unhappy. Trump is a very effective marketer. He has these catchy slogan campaigns, usually 3 words: drain the swamp, lock her up, whatever it is. He
and he didn't drain the swamp. He put like a lot of the same kind of people on him.
He didn't lock her up either. And the people chanting that 4 years later are now insisting they're clutching their pearls at the notion that Donald Trump be locked up for his criminal activity. But the point is that resonates with people, these catchy things, and we largely have a cult of personality around our political figures rather than an informed populace that is willing to look into policies and vote based on which of those policies will logically impact change for the best. Not even like, are you right or wrong about that? Right? Again, like before we get to is a plan for universal health care a good thing or a bad thing? Is the plan to slash this budget here in order to allocate funds here? Before you even, and that's where the conversations should be, but we aren't having those conversations because we haven't even bothered to get to the policy in the large part for our candidates. Right now, in the last 4 years as well, it was, is this person Donald Trump or not? If the answer is yes or no, that is what's going to impact whether or not I'm going to throw my support behind that person.
Yeah, and the main thing was that, like, actually a lot of the stuff that people were worried about, like Trump doing, was stuff that American presidents had already been doing. Like, George Bush was like detaining people in Guantanamo Bay without any charge, and he was, he started all this profiling of like Muslims and everything, and they were worried about Trump's Muslim ban and all that. But like Bush was enacting a lot of these policies, but he just like acted nicer about it. And Obama deported people and there were a lot of the things going on the border under Obama, but it's just that he had the face of being progressive, and it's just that Trump actually was out there and like said all the things he was, and this was stuff that was going on before he was even around. So that's why people had the reaction to it, because like he was actually showing the face of it.
Sure.
To me, it was nothing new from like other American presidents, really.
Yeah, starting in 2015, under Obama and Biden's administration, we had a shift from the majority of our undocumented immigrants in our country being from Mexico. So it went from the majority of our undocumented immigrants being Mexican citizens to being non-Mexican citizens under Obama. That's when that trend began, and it has
Yeah,
continued since then. It continued under Trump. It continued under Biden, and when we hear it's bizarre. It's bizarre when we hear people make these criticisms or these claims in either direction, such as a Republican saying that, Biden has these open border policies, or people who are very anti-Obama.
or that Biden's a communist is like, really. I mean, he's
Sure, yeah, when Biden's having the same border policies essentially functionally as Trump did. And yes, to your point, it always like baffles me because, and this is similar, like the way that most American Christians view the Bible, okay, or they view their religion. Almost none of them have actually read their Bible.
yeah,
Most of them have not even read a book of the Bible. For the most part, if they have any real experience with the Bible, it's they've gone to church and they've heard somebody give a sermon based on an interpretation of a passage from a book of the Bible. Okay.
yeah,
But we have a lot of people who identify as Christians. And what they do is they insert what they want to be true or their feelings or their thoughts onto what the Bible must say. Right.
yeah,
So, and it's kind of one of the problems with religion is that it's not, and I don't want to say that like people need to follow the word of the Bible because I don't want them to do that. But depending on the passage, of course, but we take this thing, we make it bigger than what it is, and then we use that to be bigger than ourselves to justify whatever it is that we already believe, right?
yeah,
I am a good person. Of course, I couldn't be a bad person. And my religion is a good thing. Of course it is. It's my religion. Why would it be a bad thing? And therefore, whatever I feel must be supported by my Bible. Okay. And then we do the same thing with our political candidates because we
yeah,
haven't gotten into the policies or their voting records or that's boring stuff. Reading the Bible's boring. Okay. So no, I'm going to say my religion and my political candidates, they're just good. Okay. So the things that I want them to say and do, that's probably true. It's a very lazy, intellectually irresponsible and lazy approach.
yeah, yeah, definitely. And they do the same thing with like the Constitution too. Like they say, like different
Yes.
views of what the founding fathers were, depending on who they are too.
Yeah. That's also an error of with things being open to interpretation. Very similar, the Constitution and the Bible, and the Constitution is much shorter, but most of them haven't read it. And when you do, basically, in the same way with the Bible, if I like this thing that the Bible says exactly the way it says, well, that's literal. But if I don't like it, well, that's obviously figurative. That's a metaphor for this other thing that I do like. Okay. And same thing with the Constitution. If I like what it actually says, I'm going to go with a strict interpretation of the Constitution. And if I don't like this thing that the Constitution says, I'm going to go with a loose interpretation of the Constitution. And either way, it happens to agree with me.
Yeah, yeah, true. And I guess what would you say like about how like the polarization right now, like how it destroys like friendships, or like how people don't seem to like, they'll cut people out of their lives, or it can even divide family members.
Yeah.
What can you say about that, or I guess what you have observed with that?
Yeah, it's tough. It's tricky. My dad passed away in November, and he lives in or lived in an opposite part of the country that I do. Um, the so I only got to see him occasionally, particularly towards the end there. I saw him about 5 years ago, and went and visited and was with him for a few days, and then a couple years went by. About 3 years went by, and I went to go see him again. And in that amount of time, so he was living in Florida, and he got Florida brain. Basically, my father was one of the 9 million two-time Obama voters that voted for Trump. And at the end of his life, he went from, I grew up in Michigan. My dad worked in General Motors car factory for 30 years and retired, moved to Florida. That's every Michigan boy's dream, is you work in a car factory for 30 years so you can go to Florida and not be cold anymore. And my dad did exactly that. But when he was there, after being an auto union worker, Democrat voter for his whole life, he goes down there and in his twilight years becomes a fervent right-winger, becomes the kind of person who doom scrolls on his phone looking at right-wing memes and then falls asleep watching Newsmax at night. And the last time that I went to go see him in person, I was with him for about a week, and it was miserable. He had gotten to the point, not his physical health, and actually that was right before he started to decline in physical health. His mental health was miserable. Everything was connected to politics. And we could not, it was just a struggle to have like polite conversation. And I don't advocate for, I strongly agree with what you said. And again, I open mentioning that my friends, if someone's going to be a friend of mine, they have to be able to have civil disagreements with me. They have to call me out when I'm making a mistake. I need my friends to see my blind spots, right? And if you're on the road and somebody sees that you're about to merge into a semi truck and they don't say it because they don't want to hurt your feelings, it's a shitty friend. Okay. So, yeah. But there's a balance to be struck there when you talk about ruining relationships with friends and family. I think every person needs to be conscientious about what they value in their friends and how much they value their families. If you are willing to lose a friendship over a political position, then you probably didn't have a very strong friendship, or it's either that, or you don't value that friendship, or you don't care about seeing that person through to your side or trying to help them understand your side. I guess it depends on how long and hard you have that conversation, but I would remind people that our time as humans is limited, and the number of people that we really have as friends, and the number of family, if you're fortunate enough to have family that you've loved and cared about at some point in your life, our time is all limited. And there are things bigger than political issues. There are things more important than that. And what is to be gained from losing a friend or family member over those sorts of things? Is there a way? I would just urge people, because our time is limited, and to think about what's productive about that. If I have a friend or a family member who is an ardent right winger or an evangelical Christian, but I love that person and I care about that person, can I separate that thing from who they are? And do I gain anything from them now not having a friend who sees things the other way? I think we are a more robust society when we have groups of friends and family who do not let those things divide them, and whether that is, we're going to learn to discuss these things in a civil way, and it can be really interesting. You hear about the classic crazy uncle around the Thanksgiving dinner table, yeah. Right? Like, that can either be a thing that you dread. Oh, I gotta go sit there with Uncle Larry and he's gonna bring this up. Or it can be a thing that, hey, that's gonna be interesting. I'm gonna learn what sort of thing Uncle Larry is thinking this year, and I'm going to ask him questions. And when I do that, maybe he'll ask me some questions. And that's what I would urge people to do. When we let political divisions let us stop talking, and we lose. And of course, it's a two-way street, right? You need people to be willing to meet you in the middle. But I would just encourage and urge anybody listening to not do that. I did the very best I could to not argue with my father, because there was no point. He was dug in. No. He was not going to. And in general, I don't recommend wasting a lot of effort and energy on arguing with elderly people. Like, even if I pull off the miracle and I get him to change his position, I'm not getting my miles out of that I would if I were arguing with somebody with a lot more ahead of them. But I didn't let that compromise the time that I had with him. I was willing to identify, hey, what am I going to get out of this? What is he going to get out of this? Can we focus on enjoying the bit of time that I have with him? And it's tough. It's tough to bite your tongue sometimes. But at the end of the day, we should get back to, what am I doing here? What is my point? What is my purpose? Am I on a debate stage, or am I eating dinner with my father, who I'm only going to have so many dinners with? And at some point, time's up for all of us. So that's my long-winded response to what do we do about these things breaking down families and friendships?
Oh yeah. Well, sorry for your loss, by the way.
No, thank you.
But that's something I've been thinking about too, is because that relates to being able to listen better to people, and being able to understand why they're thinking the way they do, because it could seem and sometimes I feel like if you listen to someone with a different view, you can kind of see that, oh, maybe they aren't really a lot of people think, oh, every Trump supporter is a racist, but some of them you could talk to and they're not necessarily racist, but they just have a different way they see things solved, or they're more concerned about their own needs, or losing their own job, or they just have they're coming from just a different angle with it, but they're not necessarily a bad person or a hateful person.
Yeah.
They just kind of came to this view based on their experience, but maybe they thought Trump was going to help their jobs, and they thought nobody was looking out for them, and they were forgotten about, and we have to help ourselves. A lot of them had that attitude, we got to help ourselves first, and that's not necessarily a racist idea. I think to me, everybody's human beings. I think we could help both, help our own and help other people too. But I can understand why someone would have that perspective and not necessarily be a bad person. It's just that they're looking out for their own needs. People look at what directly affects them. And some friends I had that were immigrants or international, because I used to actually live in a house that was mainly international students. A lot of them, of course, they'd be more nervous about the policies Trump was proposing, that would affect immigration and everything. So it's just that people are looking at what affects them the most. It doesn't necessarily mean they're a bad person because they don't see how certain policies might affect someone else. It's just that it's just what their priorities are based on their situation in life.
Yeah. And there's an inherent danger when we write people off as whatever ism or whatever thing it is. So let's take that example you gave of, oh, this person's a racist. This person's propagating racism. So one of two things is happening. Either I am a racist or I'm not, if you accuse me of being one. Okay. And if I am, and you call me that, it's okay, where do we get then? Right? Because if I agree with you that I am a racist, and you called me a racist, that was your finishing move, that was your way of dismissing me. Well, what do we get? Okay, you called me a thing, and I am that thing, yes. Or I'm not, and I know that I'm not, and you're wrong. So whenever we just jump to this shortcut of, you had this opinion, therefore I'm going to assume this conclusion about you, therefore I'm going to call you that thing and write you off. It doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. you went nowhere. In the best case scenario, you were right. That person agrees, and like you didn't actually address the face of their argument, or you assume something, you straw man them, and now you're in a mess because now you're just trying to convince somebody to take on a label that they don't agree with for themselves, and you didn't bother to understand their actual position. So it's not something I would ever recommend doing.
No.
It's very anti growth and very anti-learning in a conversation to write somebody off as a label, or even if they self-identify as a label, my encouragement would be to ask questions about what they mean by that, because it's hard to find any two people under the same label that are actually in lockstep with even 75% of things. You're going to find a lot of nuances, and that's where interesting conversation can happen.
Yeah, and who do you think it does more of not listening to the other side? Do you think it's the left or the right? I see it a bit with both. Actually, I see it a lot with the right recently too, like not being able to listen. I think it goes both ways. But what's your experience?
Well, I think the left is. It's hard to say. 5 years ago, I would have said the left is more sensitive.
Yeah.
But I don't. I think there's a lot of evidence to the contrary now.
Yeah.
I think that they're probably equally sensitive and willing to censor each other.
Yeah. Like Ben Shapiro, in particular, has been a big hypocrite recently. He used to be like talk to people who think differently than you, and what does he do? He fires Candace Owens because she said something he doesn't want.
Yeah, someone should tell Ben that facts don't care about his feelings.
Yeah, exactly.
but no, I do think that the left is less willing to hear people out, and the right, I hate to say, they get the big picture much better than the left does. And what I'm talking about is like, not necessarily the politicians themselves. The politicians on the right do a better job of like getting in lockstep, being organized, and then like doing whatever it takes to push their agenda. But in terms of the voting populace and the cultural right, they actually want, I get the impression that the right wants to win in politics. They actually want their stuff to happen, and they recognize that the way of doing that is by having as large and inclusive of a group as possible. So if people, I see a lot more people on the right that are willing to have debates. They're willing to have conversations. They don't write people off. They're not necessarily great at doing it. And they will.
And they'll still try to demonize their opponent or make them
absolutely
look stupid and stuff too. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I don't mean to be ham-fisted with my generalizations here, but the right in general is far more inclusive and open to people with that are on the fence, at least. Whereas on the left, I see a lot more like purity testing of, if you agree with me 98% of the way, but there's 2% where you disagree with me, you didn't pass my test. You're not good enough. We're going to like drag you through the mud over this 2%. And
and what's that like? You're not a good ally if you don't do this. I've seen that word a lot. Like, you're not a good ally if you don't do this and this and that. Or
usually from people outside of a certain demographic that are trying to speak for the demographic to which they don't belong. Yes,
and then when someone from that demographic speaks different, they go, "Oh, well, you don't represent all of them, or you're just
that's another great example of the labels to dismiss people, right? So if you are a white person who is conservative, there are a lot of people on the left who you have now, you're not in the club. You're not welcome to vote with us. You're not welcome to like be on board with us. You're not welcome in our conversations because you're a conservative person. Well, maybe that person is conservative either fiscally or culturally, but not both. Maybe they would be open to, maybe they are conservative, but they're open to universal health care because it is a more efficient system. Maybe they like the fiscal benefits of universal health care and they would have voted with you on that, but you ran them off because they are culturally conservative. Yeah. I see more bridges on the right of, oh, you will support our agenda? Cool. come on over. Whereas, and in that example, if you're a conservative white person, well, you're a right winger, you're not in the club. If you're a conservative black person, oh, well, you're an Uncle Tom,
Yeah.
pick whatever term that they're using. You are not allowed in the club. And what do you think is going to happen when you're trying to build a political movement out of exclusiveness? You have a tinier number of people,
Yeah.
and the group that is more inclusive is going to then have more political gains than you, which really sucks, because I feel like that is the right strength, is they are more inclusive and they are more willing to actually make those sacrifices in order to get their agenda passed. Whereas the left is more right, by which I mean correct. Like, they have the better policies, the way I should say it without a confusing synonym. The left has better policies, but then they suck at building an inclusive coalition where they can actually win.
Well, and they're also not good at like self-reflecting or seeing like how they're making their arguments in an ineffective way, or how they're I'm just thinking of something else that's like they get stuck on some silly things, like Aaron Bushnell, the guy who burned himself alive recently. I remember one of them were saying that he was doing cultural appropriation because he burned himself alive. Those,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah, and it, like in during the Trump election, like many of them weren't like reflecting on like what they could have done, like to maybe not get Trump elected, like
Mm-hmm.
that they weren't really trying to persuade people that didn't already see things their way. And they also, like, a lot of it was too, like the like middle America and the Rust Belt too, like also didn't feel like they were being listened to by the left too. I know it was part of it too.
Yeah, they weren't.
Yeah.
And imagine if you're somebody who feels that, again, so you feel like your job has been lost to undocumented Mexican immigrants, okay? Whether it has been or hasn't been, you feel that it has been, okay? So if I'm on the left, what I would like to see people do is say, hey, well, let's have a conversation about that. Let's look at some of the facts. Let's see, and what can we do about solving your problem? You lost your job. What's your evidence for that? Why do you think that you lost it to them? Can we look at, did you actually lose your job to immigration? Or was it automation? Or was it an obsolete industry that's making cuts? Like, what is the actual source? And then let's get to solving.
That's like, because like I don't want them to be scapegoated like immigrants or like Mexicans, but I also like, you need to address that person's need and give them a better alternative than going with the right wing that's going to just single those people out. So.
Sure. And if the problem is, yes, you lost your job to immigration, well, let's dig into that then. What should we do? Is the correct solution to reduce immigration, or is it to solve illegal immigration by getting in work visas? And is the issue to crack down on corporations that are paying these people less than what they're able to pay you illegally? Is that the solution? But none of these more nuanced and interesting conversations that I would like the left to have with that example of somebody on the right who feels that they have literally lost their job and they've assigned it to these things. Instead of having that conversation and working towards solutions, if you hear somebody say, they took my job, and you go, you're a racist, fuck you, well, you're not going to then win that person over. And of course, they are going to feel frustrated because their pain is real.
Might push them more in the direction of like.
Absolutely. One of the things that unions were able to do successfully would be having post-political movements that were focused on getting something done, where you could have people who were different religions. You could have people that were aligned differently politically, and it's like, okay, yes, brother, you feel that way, I feel this way, but right now we're on the line together, and we're going to focus on this thing because you are largely right wing and I'm largely left wing, but right now we both agree in worker rights, and that's what we're fighting for, and that's what we're doing today. So that's what we're going to focus on. And we've moved away from that, not only in the case of unions, but in general, like where if you want to win, you've got to accept somebody who, maybe they disagree with you on a lot of things. It might even be the majority of things, but we could make progress if we found some bipartisan issues. And when everything becomes partisan, we can't do that. And so we just don't make progress.
Yeah, because I was actually thinking, even like when the George Floyd thing first happened, I feel like there was more unity. Like everybody kind of saw that video, and then it was like, okay, maybe now there can actually be a change with that. But then things just start went in a whole different direction because everything got polarized again somehow. But I remember there was some unity when the George Floyd thing first happened. That was like kind of a wake up call to everybody. Like, okay, we need to do something to change this. But then things got like more polarized. I don't know if that was all the left or was just the way things just went, but
Well,
I don't know
yeah,
what was your.
I feel like that's a situation where the vast majority of people would agree in this individual case, this was wrong. Now, not everybody, right? You're still going to have some people that are so entrenched, and it's the power of the human desire to be right, that some people have dug in their heels before that point so hard on being just pro cop. And I don't even want to say that comes from a negative place. Let's say
Yeah.
your father is a good cop or you are a good cop, right? And
Mhm.
for years you have seen this pushback against police brutality, and you're going, but that's not me, but that's not me, but that's not me, and I'm taking heat for this. And you keep bringing up examples, right? And then you feel like, okay, well, this is just one more example, and we're going to draw the conclusion that, and you're the individual who's the exception in the system, and you struggle to see the system for what it is or to criticize the system, right? So there are situations where, with some degree of justification, people would still push back, but or they were just, again, so entrenched in being pro cop that
Yeah.
even something like the George Floyd film, they would dig into it. And you did
Yeah.
see that too. You said, oh, well, he was on, whatever reason, they find a reason to criticize Floyd.
Also another like hypocrisy with them is like they say they want to say all lives matter. They don't want to say Black Lives Matter, but then they want to say Blue Lives Matter. So it's like,
Sure. Yeah. Um,
yeah,
which, side note, and we could go in this different direction, but the left also sucks at marketing,
yeah.
which I can get back to,
No, I
but
agree.
but yeah, you have a situation where most people looked at that and said, this, in this individual case, this is just wrong. This is unacceptable, and it shouldn't be hard to get a bipartisan take on, is slowly and publicly murdering a man for being accused of a crime in a public street, is that bad? Like, that shouldn't be controversial.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't need something to be that uncontroversial to be partisan. But you're also existing in a very partisan climate. So even a little bit of this is how graceful we are in victory, if we want to call it that. So if you've been arguing something for years, you've been shouting from the rooftops, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a thing, this is happening, we got to do something about this. And people are telling you, no, we don't, you're wrong, they've written you off, they think you're crazy. And then something comes along and proves that you were right, or there's just an ironclad example of what you've been talking about. The temptation is to do a victory lap. The temptation is to, I'm going to slam dunk this on people, and I'm going to point out how stupid they've been. Now, does that make it easier for people to come to your side when you're dunking on them? No. Again, we get defensive, right? This is what happens. People are offended by facts, let alone being offended by emotional exaggeration or hyperbole.
Yeah, and that's kind of like the thing that also is like, I feel like the left and the right are kind of arguing with people who don't exist. Like, they're not really
Yeah.
arguing with each other. They paint a caricature of what they think the other side is, and they're arguing with that. Because like Blue Lives Matter, like they just think everybody on the left is saying let's kill all cops,
Sure.
like even though they're good, and then on the left they think it's like, oh, everybody on that side just wants people
A
of
police
color to
state
just be killed by the
yes.
police.
Yeah.
Like really, like if you sit down, if you go to individual people, like people probably on both sides like wouldn't want like a regular cop to be shot or an innocent person of color to be shot. So
No, in reality, people probably want almost exactly the same thing.
yeah,
Like, and that's what's kind of funny. The police brutality issue is a very interesting one because the the left largely wants the police state, or the not the police state, the state of police. They want police in America to function the way that the right thinks that they do. So the left's dream for police is what the right think the police actually are. Okay, so so they actually want the same thing.
yeah. Well, like
They
community policing, like being
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, a lot of the right think the police are good guys. They have the best intentions. There's a few bad apples. The left wants to see resources reallocated so that police can be more present community partners. They would like to see the police reflect the community that they serve. They would like to see police serve a community rather than just exist to defend personal property and write tickets and whatever. But like, yeah, so they actually want the same thing. They disagree with how to get there, and then they talk past each other. So yes, you're absolutely right. I think that, and of course, you'll find very fringe examples because those are the things that are the most interesting. So that's what winds up on like libs of TikTok or whatever.
Yeah.
Like these are the things that get spread around. You're going to see the screaming pink-haired banshee on a college campus, and that becomes the mascot for the left.
Yeah.
And you're going to see the guy with his Trump and Confederate flags waving in the back of his F-250 as he rolls coal on Prius. Like, and they're going to say, that's the right, that's the mega right there. So they're not, right? That's just not like those do not represent the average person, but those are very easy supervillains for us to make. And if I could elaborate about my frustration of the left sucking at marketing, and I actually I lost a YouTube friend, a friend of mine who we met through YouTube. I lost a person over this. This person like removed me, blocked me, didn't want to be around me because several years ago I pointed out that Black Lives Matter is not a good choice for a slogan. I have a very simple note for that slogan. And these things, unfortunately, they kind of come
because
up.
I think a lot of people didn't understand it was saying like Black Lives Matter too. It wasn't saying that
yes,
other lives don't matter. It was saying that, hey, we matter too, because like they felt like their lives were being treated as insignificant.
Yes, you just fixed it, actually.
Yeah.
You made the same edit that I would make. You take the same slogan and you say, Black Lives Matter too. You add 3 letters to it, 1 word, right? And now there can be no confusion of what you meant, okay? Now, this upsets people when I say something like that. Hey, the slogan should have been Black Lives Matter too. Well, the people are just being obtuse and they know what we meant, but they chose not to know.
A lot of people didn't know. That's the thing. Like a lot of people didn't get it until it was explained to them. Like they had to. Like that's why it's easy for a lot of people. Like because a lot of people, the left doesn't always just explain their view. Sometimes they put it in the same with the defund the police.
Yes.
Like they just meant
terrible marketing
the police and make community policing. They didn't mean get rid of the police altogether. Well, some of them did, but most of them didn't. But,
correct. Yeah. Terrible marketing, right? Like the way that you market your ideas matters. And then you will have people on the left that are like straight-faced willing to say, well, it's not my job to educate you on what we mean by this. You should go educate yourself on that sort of thing. What the hell? You're the one saying these things. And again, it sucks because you're right. Yes. The idea of Black Lives Mattering to to say, hey, their lives also matter and they're being treated as if they don't.
Yeah.
That's a good message. And that's a message that could and should hit home with a lot of people. And you miss the mark. And rather than correcting on it, we just get upset if we bother to mention that that's a misstep. And something like defund the police it's literally not the words. Black Lives Matter is just, you didn't finish the thought, right?
Yeah.
You left it too open to interpretation. Defund the police is actually not what the left wanted. They didn't want the police themselves to be defunded. They wanted funds reallocated for police services. That doesn't fit into like 3 words. I'm sure you could have found a number of things, like you could have used something that even sounds positive, but then when you ask questions for that, you can get into the specifics, like refund the police or reform the police. You could use something like that then allows people, instead of feeling negative and abrasive and turned off, and you give Republicans talking points and sound bites, instead of that, use something that gets people intrigued, gets people interested, gets them to ask you questions. If you say defund the police, I heard your point. You said to defund them. Got it. Oh, you meant reallocate funding? Well, that's not what you said. So don't blame them for not understanding what you meant when you said the opposite.
Yeah, that's another thing, because it's like the left has a lot of good arguments and things they just they don't articulate them well. They don't know how to make them well, and then they think they're all these other things, and then a lot of the right-wing media is attacking them for these things that they think they're saying and that most people think they're saying, that if they would just explain it and make it clear, they would, more people would listen to it. So
which you have to do, right? If your whole point is to change people's minds or get people interested in seeing things a different way, it is your job to then at least be clear, to articulate what your position is. And again, if we're going to have conversations about the nuances, we need to know what our own position is and what the opposition's position is. And we should be making it as easy as possible for the opposition to understand what our position is.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and understand theirs too, like you said, like know what we're arguing against.
Yeah. Which comes from asking questions.
Yeah. And that got me thinking about misinformation, because I know like there's also a lot of misinformation with the internet, and people are quick to believe misinformation that confirms their own biases too. But at the same time, it's like, how do you combat that? Because you don't want big tech or like corporations censoring what can and can't be said, because then people in power could just say this is misinformation if it makes me look bad. What's your thoughts on that? Like,
it comes back to we have to be responsible consumers of information and media at large. We have to be conscientious of the things to which we are vulnerable. There is nothing there's no lie easier to convince people of than the things that they want to be true. Okay. Millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars have gone into people buying Bowflexes and shake weights and electrical devices to strap to their abs, because they wanted to believe that if they did electrotherapy on their stomach, then they could sit and eat chips on a couch and not have to diet or exercise, and they'd have a 6-pack. Like, they want to believe that so badly that they will depart with their money in order to buy a diet pill or a piece of equipment that they think is going to make fitness easy, right? People, if you want to believe something, we need to recognize that we are now very vulnerable to being convinced of anything that suggests it. That's usually, in today's landscape, that's a headline that we don't need to bother clicking and reading the article or questioning the source unless we disagree with it.
Yeah.
And then we still don't need to do that. If we see a headline with which we disagree, we'll just Google the opposite, find the first thing, click on that without actually reading anything, and there we go. I'm actually right. So the first thing to do is be hyper sensitive to our own vulnerabilities of misinformation. And the easiest lie to accept is the one that we want to believe. Oh, there was how many times do you see a clickbait thing about, a study found that chocolate is actually fights cancer. Oh, okay. And it turns out to be, there was one instance in one of many testing that showed this thing on this subject or whatever. But we wanted it to be true. So I didn't look into that shit. I just said, hey, let me get a Hershey's bar. Or maybe it's like extra dark cocoa. That's, we didn't get into any of those details. We didn't get any of that nuance. So, but the effect of me going in justifying an excessive consumption of chocolate is real, right? That happens. But I found a way to justify negative behavior because I wanted it to be true. I wanted to believe that this thing that's bad for me is actually good for me. So I bought it. And we just need to be conscientious of that. I don't have a lot of confidence that we are going to force other people to be more considerate of our own view. But I do think that I do have a bit more confidence that individuals can become more responsible consumers of media and information. And that's something that I try to work on with my students. It's something that I encourage among my friends and family members. And that's a way of doing it. It has to be encouragement. And we just have
I guess you need to question the most, maybe when it does confirm your bias.
Like absolutely. That is the things that I am going to be the most skeptical about is when I feel myself. I've caught myself. I'm proud to say I have never shared anything on social media, like a link to something or a video without actually reading and being critical of it. But I've thought about it. I have moved a mouse in that direction to say here's a thing that if that were true, that would be really useful. This would reinforce what I believe, but oh shit, I didn't even read that article yet. I didn't even check where the source was to that thing. Yeah. And I've caught myself doing that, and I'm conscientious of it. So I'm borderline hyper conscientious of it, and I've caught myself on the verge of it. So how susceptible is somebody who doesn't even realize that personal bias or confirmation bias is a thing, right? So how do we help with that? I would say we gently encourage the people who are close to us. People are very skittish about being corrected. So we have to be gentle about how we do that. And asking good questions is one of my recommendations for doing so. Hey, how do you know that's true? Or where did this information come from? Where'd you hear that? Why do you believe that? That's interesting. Could you tell me more about it? How many sources told you that? Or how many places have you heard that? I haven't heard that at all. Where did you hear it from? Asking questions that are not abrasive and getting people to start being more careful. And often, almost never is somebody going to admit that they did something foolish in the moment, but you can plant seeds and you can get people to say, oh, maybe I need to think about that next time.
I guess you kind of got to leave your ego out of it too. Cause I guess that's most people's instinct. They hear something that goes against their values is to just be like, oh, I'm going to fight that. I'm going to say this, or I'm going to avoid, but it's, you kind of just have to take a deep breath and okay, then start asking questions okay, what led you to think that? Where'd you get that information?
Yeah.
And then actually have a conversation with them, which isn't easy to do. It takes practice.
Absolutely not. But you have to ask yourself what your goal is. Is your goal to have the catharsis of dunking on someone and getting out and saying, oh, you're so wrong about that. Boom. Let me put you in your place. If all you really, and this is true for a lot of people, I really think all they do is they care about that cathartic feeling of how good it feels to be right and how good it feels to put people in their place.
Yeah.
If that's your goal, you can stop there. But if your goal is to actually help people, if your goal is to win people over to your side, if your goal is to change hearts and minds, that is counterproductive. It's not just non-productive, it's counterproductive. You're doing more harm than good, and it's important you recognize that. It's also worth recognizing that if that's what, and I've had these arguments with people, like you are making it harder for those of us that are trying to do the work, right? Like, just be neutral. Just shut up. If you don't have the patience to have that back and forth, most people are not Daryl Davis. Most Black Americans are not going to sit down at a table across from a Ku Klux Klan member and have that conversation. But what I don't want you to do is shout over Daryl Davis having that conversation. If he's being the saint out there doing that work, being patient, taking the time, I don't expect everyone to do that. But
because that's like an extreme, like I said, but like you could do it with like an everyday person who might have a different view, do the Daryl Davis approach.
Sure.
Because most people you meet aren't going to be Ku Klux Klan.
No. But even if you're unwilling as, say, a right-wing person to have a calm, interrogative conversation with a left-wing person, you don't have to. Just don't. Like, you also don't need to dunk on them every time that you think they were wrong about something, because whether you're on the left, you're on the right, or whatever your position is, you are doing more harm to your side than good by engaging in those cathartic exchanges that make you feel like you get that satisfying feeling of being right.
But ironically, that's kind of one of the popularity of one of the rights figures who we mentioned earlier, but Ben Shapiro, like, I notice he rarely debates somebody who's like an academic on the left. Like, he won't debate like a Noam Chomsky or like,
of course not,
who's learned on the left. He'll go to college campuses and then he'll say things in a very opinionated way. And because he's so opinionated, he must be right. And then it's like, oh, I pwned you, next.
Yeah, of course. Why would you, but you got to think about, what is Ben's role? What is his job? What is his goal? Is Ben Shapiro's job to convince people on the left that they are wrong? Is his job to win over the hearts and minds of the people on the left? Of course not.
Probably, I don't think it is. I think it's more just like catharsis for like people on the right, or like
absolutely
honage culture,
Yes. So he is, and he doesn't have to be right. He doesn't have to be patient. He just has to put out red meat for his base to eat up. And that is his goal. That is all he cares about in regard to his professional presentation. So he's successful at his goal. I would challenge you. What is your goal? I mean the royal you here, listeners, anybody else, right? Like, what is your goal when you're going to have an exchange with somebody? Is your goal just to dunk on them and feel good about you being right and them being wrong? And if so, are you doing this in a way that's going to make it hard for people that are trying to have a patient conversation and actually change their mind? Or is your goal to change their mind? Because our approach is often counterproductive to what we would say our goal is, because doing the work that goes into actually achieving that goal is fucking hard. It requires patience, and very rarely are you going to get a tangible win. Very rarely is somebody it takes a very long time. Daryl Davis is another extreme example. It's a guy who has over 200 KKK robes that have been turned in from people he's literally converted. But most of us, even if we are patient, we're never going to have that kind of tangible, objective example of these are the ways that I change people's minds, because very few times are they going to come back and tell you that.
Yeah, and there was actually a Muslim woman that did a similar approach as Daryl Davis, Dia Khan. She did a movie, White Right, that's worth checking out if you haven't checked it out, where she did kind of the same thing with like neo-Nazis and stuff. She got them, like, she just talked to them and she got them to kind of see things in a different way.
Yeah. Very few times do we get that like objective, tangible win, right? Where I was successful here. I got through to somebody. I spent 2 years gradually having these conversations, and this is a win, and I feel good about it, and it encourages me. It puts fuel in my tank to do it again. Very rarely are you going to get that. So you have to know that going in. It's being patient. It's not expecting somebody to give you credit when you're right. It's removing your ego from the equation, but it is dramatically increasing your odds of actually being productive, and at the very least not being counterproductive to your own side.
Right, and I guess we kind of gave final thoughts in a way, but I mean, final thoughts about finding nuance or any of that, or
Yeah, I would just say, I just reiterate, um, ask questions. There's the quote that's, as I understand, has been misattributed to Walt Whitman of um, be curious, not judgmental. Um, as I get older, I see more and more value in curiosity, in asking questions, in not jumping to not jumping down somebody's throat. And when it's like an amazing effect, especially now when people are so polarized and so conditioned to be defensive. They've got their arguments queued up, ready to go. They're ready to have that back and forth. And it stalls people and it forces them to think, and usually in a very positive way, when instead of being combative, you come at them with genuine questions, with a genuine interest to understand their perspective. And it's amazing how often they will reciprocate that, even if they had no intention to. They were ready to tear your head off 5 minutes ago, but you listened to them, you heard them out, you conceded when they made a good point, and then here they are asking you to explain your position. It's like it's this like amazing potential that we all have. And if people hear this conversation and a few more people in the world are doing that instead of talking past each other, I'd say this is a productive use of our time.
yeah. And I would say even through having this conversation, I it kind of motivated me to make sure I do that more. Just
Yeah.
hear people out and have conversations rather.
Yeah.
So it's not always the easiest thing to do.
Next time, let's find something that we fervently would argue about and model how to do that well.
Yeah, I'm sure we could. We could probably find something we disagree on.
Yeah, that would be fun.
Yeah. But yeah, thank you for coming on, and thank you to the listeners. If any listeners have or any of you in an echo chamber, your thoughts on experiences on this topic, or what your experiences have been, or what you learned from listening to this talk. And I guess you want to plug your channel or anything?
Yeah, if anybody wants to, I post fairly sparsely these days, but every few months I put something out, and my channel is Grappling Ignorance on YouTube. Sure, you'll link to it if you'd like to. There's most of my content is essentially short video essays on a wide range of topics. Starting off several years ago, I was more focused in religion, but my topics of conversations have broadened greatly. There's quite a wide range of things that are found on the channel, so Grappling Ignorance is where you'd find that.
Cool. And that actually just made me think maybe that's something we could debate on, though I'm not religious, but I'm not exactly an atheist either. So I guess that's something we probably could kind of have
Sure.
a back and
Yeah.
forth on.
It'd be fun to find a few topics where we'd butt heads and model how to listen to each other sometime.
Yeah.
So,
All right,
man.
Well, for those of you who want to keep updated with future episodes of Let's Talk About the Deep Stuff, I'm on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And follow me on social media. Let's Talk About the Deep Stuff. And that's about it for this episode. We'll catch you on the next one.
Sometime.
Yeah.
So.